First of all, I'm going to look very, very briefly at the Arbitral Tribunal's timeline, how we got to this point. Secondly, I will briefly summarize the main points of the ruling. Thirdly, I'll look at regional responses to date. And finally, I'll speculate on the big question, what happens next? Okay, so on the 22nd of January 2013, the Philippines initiated compulsory dispute resolution procedures against China at the International Tribunal at the Law of the Sea. It was the first of the claimant countries to initiate illegal proceedings on this dispute. The proximate cause was China's de facto seizure of Scarborough Shoal in April-May of 2012, and just a general feeling in the Philippines, a general feeling of frustration that the dispute was moving in the wrong direction and that they needed to do something about it. Now, the Philippines did not ask the ITLOS to determine issues of territorial sovereignty or maritime boundary delimitation. That can only be, issues of territorial sovereignty can only be adjudicated by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and that a case involving territorial sovereignty would require the consent of both parties. Instead, the Philippines submitted 15 disputes, which can be divided roughly into three categories. First, was China's historic rights claim to living and non-living resources within the 9-dash line compatible with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? Secondly, what was the status and therefore the entitlements of certain geographical features in the South China Sea occupied by China? Were they islands, were they rocks, or were they low tide elevations? Now that may sound very esoteric, but it's important because the status determines the maritime jurisdictional zone. An island is entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. A rock is only entitled to a 12-mile territorial sea. A low tide elevation is not entitled to any maritime jurisdictional zones. Thirdly, the Philippines asked whether the court to determine whether certain Chinese activities in its exclusive economic zone had violated its sovereign rights. On the 19th of February, China rejected the Philippines' submission and thereafter adopted a policy of non-appearance and non-participation in the proceedings. In June, a 5-member arbitral tribunal was constituted, composed of 5 experts on the law of the sea. On the 30th of March 2014, the Philippines submitted a detailed memorial, that is a longer description of its arguments to the court. China was offered the opportunity to submit a counter-memorial to the court. It refused to do so, but on the 7th of December 2014, it issued a position paper which rejected the tribunal's jurisdiction on the grounds that the case involved matters of territorial sovereignty and maritime boundary delimitation, and that in 2002 the Philippines and China had agreed to resolve their disputes through negotiation rather than through legal arbitration. The court, incidentally, treated that position paper as the counter-memorial. So in fact, China, as I've described it, China was a participating non-participant in these proceedings. In April 2015, the tribunal, the judges decided to bifurcate the proceedings into two halves. They would determine whether they had jurisdiction over the case first, and then if they did, they would look at the merits of the case. The hearings on jurisdiction and admissibility took place in July. And in October, 29th of October 2015, the judges announced that they did have jurisdiction to hear 7 of the Philippines disputes and that they would consider 7 more during the merits phase. That merits phase took place in November, and 2 weeks ago, on the 12th of July, the tribunal issued its ruling. I think it's fair to say that the majority of us who follow this dispute very closely were actually very surprised by the ruling. It was quite sweeping and very clear cut. Many had predicted that the judges would not rule on all of the 15 disputes. For instance, that they might not issue a decision on the 9-dash line. They might not rule on whether Itu Aba, the largest of the features in the Spratlys, is a rock or an island or something else. There was also some speculation that the judges might provide some face-saving provisions for China in its ruling. There were none, actually, as far as I can see. Okay, so here's the ruling. It's 497 pages. I'm sure most of you have read it and committed it to memory already. Those of you, a couple of you who haven't, I will distill the ruling into 5 major points. Firstly, the judges ruled that China's historic rights claim to resources, that is oil, gas, and fish, within the so-called 9-dash line that covers 80%, 90% of the South China Sea, is incompatible with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that any rights, historic rights, that China may have had, were extinguished when China ratified UNCLOS in 1996. Secondly, the judges determined that none of the features in the Spratlys were islands entitled to an exclusive economic zone. That the features were, at best, rocks entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, or they were low tide elevations which have no maritime jurisdictional zones. Thirdly, that certain activities conducted by China in the Philippines exclusive economic zone, such as its reclamation work and interfering with Philippine survey and fishermen, had violated the Philippine sovereign rights in its exclusive economic zone. Fourthly, the judges did not rule that the reclamations were illegal per se, but they did rule that they had caused irreparable damage to the fragile maritime ecosystem, and that in doing so, China had violated its obligations under UNCLOS to preserve and protect the environment. Fifthly, the judges took a very dim view of the reclamations, and they said that by undertaking these reclamations after the Philippines had made its submission, it had aggravated the dispute. The reclamations I'm referring to, of course, you've all seen these photographs. It's actually on the front of the cover of the book, although this is an updated photograph that shows the airstrip. This is Fiery Cross Reef. The image on my left shows what Fiery Cross Reef used to look like. The image on the right shows what it looks like now. And China has terraformed 7 features in the Spratlys into artificial islands. The ruling is binding on both parties and cannot be appealed. However, it is not enforceable. So, how did countries respond to this ruling? Except for China, the immediate reactions to the ruling were rather low-key and cautious. It seemed that no country wanted to antagonize China by appearing triumphalist or wanting to shame China. Very few countries, in fact, have called on both parties to abide by the ruling. The Philippines' response was quite subdued, I would say. I think it's fair enough, at least officially, it was rather subdued. It said in a statement that it welcomed the ruling and that it would issue a full statement later. Now, that full statement has not been issued yet and may not be. But as Malcolm said, President Duterte will make his State of the Union address later this afternoon, and there may be mention to the Arbitral Tribunal ruling. Philippines' new Foreign Secretary, Perfecto Yase, called on Filipinos to exercise restraint and sobriety. China's response was widely expected and not surprising. even before the ruling was issued, Chinese officials said they would not recognize it. In fact, a week before it was issued, Dai Bingguo, China's former point man on foreign policy, referred to any ruling as a mere scrap of paper. Sure enough, when it was issued, China reacted in the high dudgeon. It said that the ruling was null and void, it was non-binding, and that China would neither recognize nor accept it. Very senior Chinese officials called into question the judge's competence and even their integrity. There were insinuations, for instance, that the judges had been bribed by certain parties. A narrative was developed, it already had existed, that the case was politically instigated by the United States, aided and abetted by Japan. Chinese netizens vented their indignation at the ruling, and a number of anti-US protests took place across the country, but the government has so far kept a lid on nationalist anger. Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is not a party to this case, I hasten to add before someone from the Taiwan Representative Office jumps down my throat. But Taiwan's claims basically mirror those of China's. And Taiwan is essentially, I think, the second biggest loser in this case. Earlier this year, it had made a submission to the tribunal, even though, of course, it's not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, because it's not a member of the United Nations, in which it had argued that Itu Aba was an island capable of sustaining human habitation and therefore entitled to an exclusive economic zone. That was an argument that the judges, of course, ultimately rejected. In response, Taiwan rejected the judges' ruling, and they reiterated their sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, but they did not mention the U-shaped line, or the 9-dash line, nor did they make any mention to historic rights. And that's very significant, I think. What about now, I think we can safely say that the ruling was not only a victory for the Philippines, but also a victory for those Southeast Asian countries whose exclusive economic zones overlap with the 9-dashed line. That is Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia. As I mentioned earlier, the judges ruled that China cannot legally claim ownership of resources within the exclusive economic zones of these countries in areas where the 9-dash line overlaps with. Vietnam, I think, was the biggest winner after the Philippines in this case, because China has been claiming ownership of resources in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone for some time, and this has led to a series of 10 standoffs, including the oil rig incident in 2014. Of all the countries in Southeast Asia, it came the closest to calling on both parties to abide by the ruling. It noted that both the Philippines and China were signatories to UNCLOS and that the ruling was binding, but it didn't say these two things in the same sentence, okay? But it's the closest thing that any country in Southeast Asia has come to calling on both parties to abide by the ruling. Malaysia urged all parties to fully respect legal and diplomatic processes. That's an important phrase. Brunei did not make a statement. It's generally very quiet on the dispute, but in a media interview last week, the Deputy Foreign Minister said that Brunei was fully committed to ensuring the peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with UNCLOS. Indonesia is usually not classified as a claimant, but I do, because it's the exclusive economic zone of the Natuna Islands overlaps with the 9-dashed line. Therefore, it is in the same position as Brunei, which is regarded as a claimant. So I think there's actually 5 Southeast Asian claimants. The ruling, in a sense, validated Indonesia's long-standing position that it does not have a dispute with China in the South China Sea because the 9-dash line is incompatible with UNCLOS. However, it didn't mention these issues in its statement. It merely said it called for self-restraint and that all parties respect international law, including UNCLOS. Non-claimants. Singapore issued a statement which underlined its neutrality in this dispute and, like Malaysia, said that the parties should fully respect legal and diplomatic processes. Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos, in their statements, emphasized the importance of implementing the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea and expediting talks on a code of conduct. As expected, the United States, Japan, and Australia said that the ruling was legally binding and that both parties should abide by it. It was expected that the European Union would issue a similar statement, but due to differences among the member states, not just an ASEAN problem, clearly, due to differences among the member states, they merely acknowledged the ruling and called on the parties to resolve their disputes through peaceful means and clarify and pursue their claims in accordance with international law. Okay, so the big question, what happens next? Of course, I don't know what's going to happen next. This is just speculation. I hope it's informed speculation. Regarding the Philippines, I think that President Duterte faces a series of difficult dilemmas. And he has to resolve these dilemmas without alienating the people who voted for him, without alienating his ally, the United States, and without alienating China, who he wants to improve relations with because they deteriorated so badly under his predecessor. During the election campaign and after he was elected, Duterte indicated that he was ambivalent about the arbitration proceedings on the grounds that any ruling would not be recognized by China. Of course, he was right. He did, however, stress the need for talks with China once the ruling had been issued. Now, China seemed open to holding talks with the Philippines, but on the sidelines of the Asia-Europe meeting in Mongolia last week, reportedly, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told his Philippine counterpart that talks could only proceed if the Philippines disregarded the ruling. Okay. Now, given that the ruling is generally very popular in the Philippines, this is, of course, difficult, if not politically impossible, for the Philippines to do this. And indeed, Foreign Secretary Yasay rejected China's precondition for talks. I think the United States would also take a dim view of the Philippines. The United States supported the tribunal proceedings all through, I mean, not financially or anything. And I think they would be unhappy if the Philippines put it to one side and said, well, you know, that's all very good, but we'll forget about it for the moment. But also, I think we have to appreciate China's position as well. It's going to be very difficult for China to hold talks with the Philippines on the basis of the tribunal ruling, because that might be seen at home as recognition of the ruling and a concession to China. And that, of course, would not be acceptable to Chinese nationalists. So as a result, there is yet no agreement between China and the Philippines on where, how, or when talks should proceed. China's response. Now, what could China do next? I've posited 3 scenarios here, which I've called best, bad, and worst. In my best case scenario, China adopts a more flexible and accommodating position towards the other claimants and towards the dispute in general. It agrees to hold talks without preconditions with the Philippines. Those talks, if they are productive and constructive, they might lead to some kind of joint development initiative to develop resources, possibly at Reed Bank or somewhere like that. That would be our best case scenario. Also, in an effort to regain the trust of ASEAN, and I think trust between ASEAN and China has suffered quite a bit in the past few years, it agrees to energize talks with ASEAN on the implementing the DOC and expediting talks on the Code of Conduct. China may also, over time, nudge its claims into line with UNCLOS by stressing its sovereignty claims over the geographical features and dropping references to the historic rights within the nine-dashed line. Now, the chances of that don't seem very high. Indeed, a day after the tribunal issued its ruling, Chinese government issued a white paper which it didn't mention the nine-dashed line, but it reiterated China's historic rights in the South China Sea, and also its sovereignty over all the islands, over all the features, which it said were entitled to territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, and extended continental shelf. So in fact, the overall tone of that white paper was very inconsistent with the tribunal's ruling. In my bad case scenario, China continues to insist on its territorial and jurisdictional claims within the nine-dashed line. It increases its naval and coast guard presence in the South China Sea, and it accelerates its military buildup on the 7 artificial islands. I think this approach is already in evidence. Within days of the ruling, China had announced naval exercises off Hainan Island. It had continued to prevent Filipino fishermen from accessing Scarborough Shoal, which the judges said China could not do. That it would start regular air patrols over the South China Sea, and to underscore this, it flew a long-range bomber over Scarborough Shoal, and that it would continue to develop the facilities on its man-made islands. Now, under my bad scenario, China could take further measures. It might declare straight baselines around the Spratly Islands, which would mean that China was claiming that the waters within the islands are its internal waters. And it might also declare an air defense identification zone over parts of the South China Sea or over the Spratlys. Excuse me. In my worst case scenario, China does all the things in the bad case scenario, but also moves more aggressively against Philippine interests in the South China Sea. Now, what could that be? It could impose a blockade on Second Thomas Shoal. This is a Philippine warship that was grounded in 1999 on Second Thomas Shoal. There's a handful of Marines live a pretty miserable existence on this vessel. China could try and blockade supplies, as it did a couple of years ago, or even try and drag this vessel off the reef, as has been suggested in state-run press. Or, I think in the very worst case scenario, China could start reclamation work at Scarborough Shoal and turn this feature into another man-made island. There's been some speculation as well whether in a fit of pique China might actually withdraw from UNCLOS. That has been mentioned. I don't think that is a serious possibility, though. It would be highly damaging to China's reputation, and also it would not serve its maritime interests well in issues outside of the South China Sea dispute. How will the United States respond? The United States, I think, will continue to call on both parties to abide by the ruling, especially China, and encourage other countries to do likewise. Now, domestically in the US, the ruling has strengthened the hand of those who argue that the United States should ratify UNCLOS. The US has signed but not ratified UNCLOS. And because it hasn't ratified it, it leaves itself open to accusations of hypocrisy, especially by China, who says, well, how can you call on us to abide by the ruling for an agreement that you haven't even ratified? But ironically, it also strengthens the hand of those in the United States who argue that the United States should not ratify UNCLOS because compulsory dispute resolution procedures could undermine its interests, as they have undermined China's interests in this case. But I don't think the Senate is going to vote on UNCLOS anytime soon. What role will the US military play in the coming weeks and months? Well, I think that's largely dependent on what actions China takes. US officials have said that the US military will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. This, I think, means that the US will be obligated to challenge an air defense identification zone, should China declare one, by flying aircraft through it unannounced, as it did over the East China Sea in 2013. Or by conducting so-called freedom of navigation operations through the Spratly Islands, especially if China declares straight baselines around the Spratlys, because that is in violation of UNCLOS. Only archipelagic states can do that. You can't do it around small islands. Now, this raises the prospect of regular close encounters between US and Chinese forces. The majority of encounters to date have been professional, but they fuel tensions between the two countries, and a miscalculation by either side could result in a military incident which might escalate into a bigger crisis. In our worst case scenario, my worst case scenario, I think if China begins reclamation work at Scarborough Shoal, that would be viewed by the United States as highly provocative. And if China were to move against Filipino forces on Second Thomas Shoal, that could actually trigger the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. It could, in short, the Philippines might call on the United States to support its forces on Second Thomas Shoal or elsewhere. That's a dangerous situation. We have that. Even in our best case scenario, I think we are likely to see further US FONOPs in the South China Sea in the near future. My guess is the next one will be at Mischief Reef. Okay, ASEAN. As we all saw, and we've all read in the press, ASEAN foreign ministers met yesterday and they were unable to issue a joint statement, reportedly due to differences over the South China Sea and, once again, Cambodia's intransigence over the issue. Apparently they're still working on it and that they might issue a statement later in the week. But I think that it's a pretty disappointing and sad state of affairs when we don't expect ASEAN to do anything now to manage the problem in the South China Sea. All we're speculating on is whether ASEAN can actually issue a joint statement on the issue. That's essentially what it's come down to, I think. If tensions increase in the next few weeks because of these scenarios that I outlined, I think that could have a negative spillover effect at the ASEAN Leaders Summit and at the East Asia Summit in September, and once again put ASEAN unity over the South China Sea under pressure. Okay, that was exactly 25 minutes, and you will note that during the course of my talk, I did not mention the Permanent Court of Arbitration once. That's for Jay to talk about. Thank you.